Hey everybody, so today we are going to learn about evidence of evolution. So this is a picture of a tortoise on the Galapagos Islands that Darwin studied to look at this. So there is evidence supports evolution. There is genetic, morphological, and molecular evidence from living and extinct organisms, and that adds to our understanding of evolution. So the different evidences of evolution that you need to know are geographical, so there are patterns in the distribution of organisms and of their habitats. There is physical evidence, and we talk about comparative anatomy. This is something you probably heard from honors or regular bio, is that we look at the bone structures of organisms. So, for example, a human arm has this very similar bone structure to a whale fin. And so we'll talk about homologous structures and vestigial structures. There is also the fossil record. So there's transitional species where you see different fossils that show the change in like the ear shape of from wolf-like creature to a dolphin and a whale. Also in the fossil record, we know that deeper rock layers are older than younger or more superficial, and so those organisms that are on the deeper rock layers are older than the ones that are more superficial. Lately, in the last 30 or so years, biochemical evidence has become really pronounced, and that's comparing biomolecules like proteins and differences in DNA. And then also there's mathematical evidence. So people do models and they support and illustrate evolution. Okay, so fossils. So fossils are preserved. They can be bones that are preserved, or sometimes they're soft tissues that are preserved. And the fossil itself can be used by dating to find the age of it. You can date the rock around it. So carbon-14 dating is something you might have heard of, and that's where they look at the decay of, so carbon-12 is the normal atom, and carbon-14 is an isotope, so it has 2 extra neutrons, and so they can, and it decays at a known rate, so they can look at the ratio of those carbon-14 atoms. And also the geographical location. So for example, if it's lower, it's deeper, it's older than if it's more towards the surface. So transitional forms show changes in organisms over time. So here you have one dinosaur, Dromaeosaurus, and then it has, over time, it's evolving to an Archaeopteryx, which is a very famous fossil that they found. And so you can see how part of the hip bone is changing and how the tail, like the vertebrae, are going down, 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 right? So you see these different transitional fossils that show the change over time in these organisms. So Archaeopteryx is famous because it was one of the first fossils that showed that some dinosaurs had feathers, and so that they were ancestors of some of the birds we have now. Okay, so physical and comparative anatomy evidences. So homologous structures is what divergent evolution gives us, where you have a common ancestor and then those characteristics change over time but have a similar structure. Vestigial structures are the structures that don't have any use anymore and have gotten smaller, and we'll talk about those. And analogous structures show convergent evolution. So I would just draw on your paper what divergent looks like and what convergent looks like. So morphological, so morph means shape, homology means similarities. So shape similarities show a common ancestry. So another thing to know is that when we are talking about anatomy and evolution, the easiest path is what's going to happen. So for example, here's a whale. and it has a little fossilized ankle bone. So is it an easier path for that whale to have developed an ankle bone that it doesn't use, or to have evolved from an organism or a species that had an ankle, right? So it's an easier path that it just evolved from something that already had one than to develop it all on its own. Okay, so here is divergence. So here is your common ancestor, right? And here divergence means it's going to different, right? And so it's a change from a body form of a common ancestor, which is a stem reptile, and they produce homologous structures. And homologous structures are similar structures regardless of function. So for example, a chicken wing, right, has a very different function than a human arm, right, or a porpoise fin. So these all have similar structure, but different functions. So that's divergence. Convergence is where distant ancestors evolved to have similar structures based on their environmental pressures, and that produces analogous structures. So homologous structures are structures that are similar in the structure but different functions, and analogous structures are different structure, similar functions. So an example of this would be the fly wings and bat wings or bird wings. So these are analogous structures. So they have a similar function, right? They use them to fly, but they have a very different bone structure, or whatever insects have, exoskeleton structure. So they would be analogous. The environmental pressure is that they both need to fly, and so they develop something similar, but it has a very different structure underneath it. So vestigial structures are features that don't have any purpose. So for example, our tailbone, or whales have a hip bone because that they don't use for legs anymore because they don't have them. And then actually snakes have some small legs and pelvis inside of them. Another type of evidence is biochemical. And so we can compare DNA and RNA of proteins. So the more similar the DNA sequences, that means the more similar the organisms are. And so here's a table that you can would be an example of what you might see. So if you're looking at the amino acid differences, and so the more time that passed, the more differences they're going to have. So from like human to gibbon, they have 18.1 different amino acids in this certain protein that they're measuring, versus the chimpanzee only has 8.8. So that means that the gibbon diverged before the human and the chimpanzee. Okay, and then if you look at like the gibbon and the chimpanzee, they're pretty darn different because they have this max number, whereas the orangutan and the gorilla are more similar because they have a smaller number. Okay, so molecular and cellular processes are also conserved throughout all organisms, certain ones. So conserved means kept the same. So there is evidence in structure and function that all organisms came from a common ancestor. So they share DNA and RNA, right? And they use that to carry out protein synthesis and to transfer genetic information. And then also, if you remember back to metabolism, everything has to have a way to make ATP, and all organisms on the planet do glycolysis. So that is a conserved process, which means that it's more likely that all organisms came from a common ancestor that did glycolysis than each organism or species evolved glycolysis on its own. So hope that was helpful, and we'll see you next time.